In 1914, Freud wrote a paper called Fausse Reconnaissance, which means false recognition. In this paper, Freud explains a common moment in psychoanalytic work where a patient is talking about a memory or an important personal insight. Then suddenly stops and says, "Well, I've already told you this," even though they haven't actually said it before. The analyst who carefully listens to everything the patient says knows that this is a completely new information and has never been shared before during analytic sessions. Freud explains that if the analyst directly disagrees and says, "No, you haven't told me this before," the patient doesn't just accept it. They react strongly. They become defensive, upset, and completely convinced that they already said it in an earlier session. That belief feels certain and cannot be changed. Freud says that trying to solve this by arguing with the patient or proving them wrong would it be what he calls an unpsychological proceeding, which means that if an analyst starts debating who is right about something that was said before, the analyst misses the real purpose of psychoanalytic sessions. The analyst is no longer trying to understand the patient's mind. They are just trying to win an argument. He also adds something important. Even if one person is wrong, let it be the analyst. The analyst is also human and can forget things. So they need some humility and must accept that their own memory isn't perfect. The real goal of psychoanalysis is not to prove who is right, is to understand why the patient feels so sure about something that isn't true. Later in the paper, Freud admits that in most cases, the patient is the one who is mistaken. Sooner or later, they realize they never actually told the story before. So, if the experience shows that the patient is usually wrong, why not just calmly prove it and move on? Why not clear the confusion straight away? Why leave that uncomfortable tension in the room? The analyst stays quiet because immediately trying to prove that the patient is wrong might make the analyst win the argument, but they lose something important to be worked in analysis, since it is the key to something much deeper in the patient's mind. If the analyst starts debating sessions that the new information was never said before, the patient becomes defensive and the deeper thoughts shut down. The mistake is not a distraction from therapy, it is the therapy. The mistake itself shows how the patient's mind is working. It reveals the hidden patterns behind the struggles. In other words, the mistake is the patient's neurosis. And this leads to another question. Why does the mind create this false feeling of déjà vu? In this situation, I've already said this. Freud explains that the patient actually wanted to say it before. They may have come close to it in earlier sessions, maybe hinted at it, almost saying it, but something inside the patient's mind blocked it. And Freud calls this force resistance, meaning an inner force that stops the person from facing something difficult or painful. Resistance is a main part of the psychoanalytic work, which happens automatically rather than by choice. While one side of the mind wants to heal by sharing secrets, a deeper part is terrified of the danger that comes with being open. This protective side fears that speaking the truth will cause a total mental breakdown, so it views analysis as a threat instead of help. These two sides get stuck in a powerful internal battle that stops any movement forward. As times go by and a session ends, the patient might finally find the courage to talk about a difficult topic weeks later. However, the brain uses a shortcut to stop the stress, and the mind confuses the memory of wanting to speak with the memory of actually having spoken. This phenomenon does not happen with small or unimportant details, but only with significant memories that the person was afraid to share. In this paper, Freud gives an example of a 12-year-old girl to show how these mental mechanisms work. The event he describes happened 28 years earlier, when the girl was 12. She visited a family friend's home and found that one of the brothers were very sick, almost dying. A few months before, her own brother had also been very ill. During that time, she had a hidden, shocking wish that her brother would be unalived. This is intense because it shows a child having such a wish toward her own sibling. From a child's point of view, children can have strong, aggressive, or jealous impulses. For this girl, admitting that she wanted her brother to die would feel completely unacceptable. She would see herself as a monster. Her mind immediately hides the wish deep down in her unconscious and locked it away so she can't access it. She forgets that she ever felt it, and for a while she's safe from that guilt. But when she visited the family's home and saw the very sick boy, her unconscious alarms off. The situations are very similar, and the hidden memory is triggered. But the paper explains that the analogy between the two situations, the shared emotional feeling, could not be allowed to become conscious. The similarity was too dangerous. If she clearly understood why that moment felt so familiar, the repressed wish in her mind would come up, and she would have to face the heavy guilt of having once wished her own brother not to be alive anymore. So the brain steps in and blocks this before it becomes fully clear to her. This shows how creative the unconscious mind can be. The brain cannot stop the feeling of familiarity from coming up. It has already been triggered. So instead, it changes it. It takes the dangerous emotional meaning and turns into something safer in a simple feeling of deja vu, of I've been here before. To fully hide the truth, the mind also shifts where the feeling comes from. So she doesn't recognize its real source as the feeling is pushed away from the real source, the sick boy and the guilt, and moved on to something safer. Instead of recognizing the emotional situation, she feels like she recognizes the place, the room, the house, the furniture. These are what seem familiar. This is her deja vu. The brain takes the strong feeling of I recognize this, removes its true meaning, which is I recognize this guilt, and replaces it with a safer one of I recognize this room. So the feeling of familiarity is completely real, but what she's truly familiar with is not the place, it is the emotional experience, the tension, and the feeling of being near someone who is very ill. At the end of the paper, Freud moves away from the confusion of false memories and describes what happens when psychoanalysis truly works. Freud talks about a moment that brings deep satisfaction to the analyst. This moment comes after months, sometimes years of careful work. The analyst has slowly found the root of the patient's neurosis, where strong inner resistance has been worked through and finally helped bring a hidden memory into the patient's awareness. In this paper, Freud gives another example of a patient who remembered as a child that he had cut his finger badly, feeling intense fear. And then he realized that he had actually cut his finger. And he was sure he had told this story before to Freud during analysis, but he actually hadn't. He had only shared the simpler, harmless version many times, while the real frightening memory had been kept hidden. Freud says that at the end of analysis, something interesting often happens. The patient finally accepts a hidden truth and then says, now, I feel as though I had known it all the time. Freud explains this in a simple way. The truth was always inside them, but it was blocked and kept out of their awareness.